All right, guys, welcome back to Marlins 9. My name is Jeremiah Geiger, and today I am joined on the podcast by Ely Sussman from Fish on First, the founder over there. Eli, thanks for coming on the pod.
Enjoy being back on with you, Jeremiah, and it's a fun time of year to talk all things Marlins with you.
It's always great to talk to you, Eli, about baseball and the state of this organization, and it's a really fun time as we, transition into July and start deadline talk, the deadline season. Trade rumors are running all over the internet, and there's a lot to talk about in terms of the future of this organization with prospects and who they're going to trade. And of course, we have the MLB draft coming up. But the bigger part of the news earlier this week is the Marlins designated for assignment Tim Anderson. I wanted to talk about that first. My initial reaction when I saw it on Twitter was, wow. Like, I did not expect that coming. Just based on the track record of being a Marlins fan, you kind of got accustomed to seeing poor production and the hesitancy to cut ties with those players. If you look at Avisail Garcia, how long it took them to DFA him, and then Tim Anderson, you sign him 1-year deal, and we're not even into July and he's DFA'd. Like, that came a little bit of a shock, but it was the right move, I think.
Yeah, well, what I'll amend your statement right there with is that we really hadn't gotten used to seeing production this bad from very many players. That was the issue with TA. Is not only was he struggling more than he had last year with the White Sox, it was even a step further than that on both sides of the ball, especially offensively. Like it just gotten to a level where for anybody watching him consistently, it was just clear that this guy is not a major league player in any role. I would say the only somewhat shock is that he went from playing basically every day to now being on in DFA limbo and on the streets. And in my guesstimation, kind of unlikely to make it back to the big leagues at any point. And to go from one extreme to the other, I guess it's a little bit comparable to Gene Segura last year, where Segura, he was playing third base close to every single day, with few exceptions, up until the trade deadline. They dump him to the Guardians knowing that he's immediately going to be released, and he hasn't really sniffed another deal to come back into pro baseball. So that is maybe the comp, and perhaps why naturally people would think maybe he would stick around until the trade deadline before this happened. But even so, like, this was really to another level where he was hitting in the low 200s. He was getting on base in the low 200s. He was slugging in the low 200s. And like with each of those figures, it just gets, it's something that I think from afar it'd be easy to gloss over the difference between a guy that is struggling and versus a guy that just it needs some really dramatic adjustments. There was that IL stint. I'm not going to speculate. I don't want to like say it straight up that it was a phantom IL stint, but it did seem like that when he had a back injury and took like a week and a half to reset and then came back. And that really didn't change a whole lot for him when that happens during the month of May. He needs to really overhaul a lot of things about his game in a way that might take an extended period of time. That might never happen. But for somebody that just turned 31 years old to have fallen as far as he has over the last couple of years, it is really rare. And yeah, it's unfortunate because just going back to signing him in the first place, there were not very many shortstop alternatives for this organization. I think what this comes back to is the Marlins had this big void at shortstop, and they were shopping for a shortstop at the wrong time where there really was not an obvious answer for them to acquire this offseason anyway. So they took a flyer. It didn't work out. And I guess you do have to commend them for recognizing halfway through instead of waiting any additional time, just admitting at this point it simply did not make any sense, and they might as well try any of their internal alternatives rather than to let this go on any further.
It's fascinating just how steep the drop off for his career has been. Like, if you consider the fact that he was a batting champion just a few years ago, an all-star. I mean, he was hitting for power. Nowhere close to being an elite power hitter, but he was still hitting, extra base hits, doubles, double digits and home runs. And then for last year, the power to be completely gone. And then this year, I mean, 3 extra base hits, 3 extra base hits is it's almost unfathomable, and I don't know. I agree with you. I don't think there's a role for him on a big league roster. Like, there's no reason for anybody to take another chance on him. I think this was his last chance in the major leagues was signing that 1-year deal with Miami. And, as a player, it sucks because I'm sure this isn't a testament to him being lazy or not working hard, but baseball's a business. And when things aren't working out, you have to credit them. They cut ties. And now we're going to see Xavier Edwards up and probably going to start the rest of the way, or the majority of the way, him and Vidal. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. But, I love seeing Edwards have an opportunity because he's young, he's hit in AAA. Give him an opportunity at shortstop. With Tim Anderson, much like Avi Garcia, I mean, they might never play again.
Yeah. Um, so it's those two. It's also Christian Bethencourt. I kind of put in
Yeah.
that same conversation where thankfully, well, it wasn't quite as visible because he was splitting playing time at catcher. And as time went on, he was even getting less than half of the starts compared to Nick Fortes. That says a lot more about Bethencourt's struggles than it did to anything that Fortes was doing to really assert himself. And yeah, that same one where at least at the shortstop position, it is a little clearer that they have this guy in Xavier Edwards who can sort of play that position. We'll find out. We'll just
Mhm.
get those reps to try to prove himself there. But at least offensively, he can give you something. Whereas, with the catching position in Bethencourt, they pick up Ali Sanchez out of AAA from the Cubs organization and throw him in there. I don't think they have especially high expectations for him, but it's about how valuable these reps are to trying to find something, even if you don't have a top prospect knocking on the door. The playing time at the big league level is so valuable. And even in a season where out of the race, you need to use that really constructively. And these decisions should be really thoughtful for every single team in the league in terms of how they are going to utilize the limited in game regular season reps that you have, just because it's so hard to simulate that otherwise. We get fooled every single year in spring training by somebody that performs really well in those exhibition games where there's nothing at stake. And even if you're facing comparable talents, there really is nothing that can replicate all facets of Major League Baseball unless you're playing in regular season games and, of course, postseason games if you're fortunate enough to get there. So, yeah, it is important. It's a reason why we still cover the team as carefully as we do throughout a season like this. It's why fans still should pay attention in the course of the season like this, because this stuff still reveals interesting things about players. Even compared from AAA to the majors, it's an entirely different animal. And we learned something from every single game and the reps that these guys get. So it makes it a little. I'm pleased that now between these series of moves that we just connected, you get to see several different guys that may potentially have a future with the organization, and they're replacing guys who just very clearly were on the way out.
Well, it's all about development. Like you said, at this point in the season, the reason I'm watching is to specifically identify and look for players who I think could give this organization value in the future. I mean, the wins and losses don't necessarily matter because when you're 25 games under 500, I'm more looking forward to the deadline. I'm looking forward to the draft, and I'm looking forward to who they bring up for the minors, the rest of the way. How are guys doing in the minor leagues? For example, Max Meyer just the other day, 4 2/3, 6 strikeouts. Again, so reliant on the slider. I've been saying he needs to throw the changeup. It's all about incorporating that third pitch. And I saw the tweet from Fish on First. It was only about 8 or 9 pitches that he used out of 80 plus pitches. He threw the changeup 9 times. I mean, the development there, that's something to monitor the rest of the way. But as we head into the deadline, just a month away, less than a month away, we have, as Marlins fans, a lot to pay attention to. I know a lot of fans have checked out. A lot of fans simply don't care. But for those of, as you covering the team daily, for me, as passionate as I am in recording the podcast every week, I want to see who do I think the Marlins could target in terms of a prospect return for some trade chips. And with Jesus Luzardo being injured, that dampers the scene a little bit, but there's still some really underrated guys that I believe have a role on contenders the rest of the way. So I kind of want to start by asking you, Eli, who do you think is most likely, three guys you think are guaranteed to be traded this deadline?
Yeah, we're starting with the Marlins side, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah, of course.
yeah, it's hard to guarantee that any of the prospects on the other angle of these deals are going to move for sure. But the most obvious one, it's really Tanner Scott and everybody else because he is the pending free agent. He is their top individual performer. He is in a particular position as a high leverage reliever that almost every single contending team should want because he makes their bullpen better. He is going to be better than the eighth best guy in their current bullpen. And on top of everything else, even his salary is relatively low for a high leverage guy. So we'll see if the Marlins even have to cover any of the money to get the kind of return that they want to. But he's owed from this point forward about $2.5 million the rest of the year, and they'll be even a little bit lower come deadline time. So he has a vast universe of potential fits where Tanner Scott could land. From there, I mean, the spiciest guy that in this consideration has to be Jazz because of, I mean, he is their best all around position player and the kind of value that he has. He is the one realistic trade chip with Luzardo sidelined for the foreseeable future. For we should mention, even with these other starters, also Ryan Weathers, he's not coming back until well after the deadline. Braxton Garrett, it seems to be the same thing. By process of elimination, Jazz is far and away the one that has the most extra value of anybody on the market. Makes a lot of teams better. The Marlins are really adamant about playing him in center field, but there are other teams, potentially contending teams, that'd be totally fine bringing him in, plugging him at second base right now, or having him split time between those positions. It's a lot of valuable value to have the versatility, and his skill set kind of speaks for itself. Everybody listening already knows how he can contribute overall as an offensive player, both hitting and base running. So it's a complex calculation from the Marlins in terms of whether they're actually, is this the highest point of his value? Are they really beyond the point of considering extending him? Is now the right time? And from my perspective, I think it's likely that he's going to get dealt, all things considered, because of the durability factor. And he has suffered so many different injuries, a couple of them severe, a couple of them even minor ones. This year has been the exception where he's missed maybe one game, two at most this entire season. And that's ultimately so critical to a player's value, is knowing they're going to be available. He has been, and I don't think you should chance it in this organization, having already taken more than dipping your toe in, but really taking one entire foot into the rebuilding waters at this point. You might as well dive in if you're going to get what you think is a fair offer for him. So it's not going to be every single contender team that wants Jazz. It is, the market is a little bit narrower because it's center field, and if you already, depending on how you feel about his center field defense, then maybe this other teams are looking at him strictly as a second baseman. But there are going to be several teams out there that could use him in one of those forms. That as long as the Marlins get multiple really impactful prospect pieces in return, then you definitely have to look at it. Then beyond that, almost any reliever potentially could go, because what we've seen is that, not only guys that can handle high leverage situations, but guys that are simply peaking at the right time and have been really consistent in their roles. Even if they have a million years of club control remaining, so much of the emphasis is on how you're doing right now. If you can help right now in certain situations. Declan Cronin is somebody whose value has gone up so much in the span of half a season from where it was in the offseason, where he was a waiver claim of the Marlins. And he's shown some really stable skills in terms of commanding his stuff and getting ground balls that I think they're going to get tempting offers for him. That if you figure you could get something substantial in return, that would be a big win, and you don't want to chance it by pushing it any further. Beyond him, yeah, the complicated one is Andrew Nardi, where the overall
Mm.
season stats are kind of underwhelming, but for the most part, he's been very good the last 2 full months, and this is on the heels of being great throughout all of last season. Where I think that he has a pretty high ceiling as a reliever, and that his value might be even higher than somebody like Cronin's. Yeah, the thing is, both of those guys, they're on such the extreme end of club control that the Marlins are thinking in their minds, are these guys going to get potentially even better next year as still relatively young pitchers? There's just no urgency on the Marlins side to move those guys in particular, but those are ones that I'm certain they're going to get some calls about and some offers to consider.
The thing with Jazz, you said the health. The health has been the key for him this year. The development in hitting left-handers has also been so huge and crucial in his development. Whereas last year he could, didn't even hit 200 against left-handed pitching cumulatively, and this year he's hitting a lot better against lefties. And it makes me wonder, if you look at the teams around the rest of Major League Baseball, he's not limited to just one position in center field. I know a lot of people look at the defensive runs saved and say, well, he's terrible and shouldn't be out there. I think he is fine. I think he does have a okay outs above the OAA. With the defensive runs saved, it's a little tricky. It's a tricky metric to really base a player's value off. But you can also put him at second base, shortstop if you really need to. But, I would rather see him in the middle infield or in center. I'm looking around at different teams who I could see being a potential fit. I think the Mariners are a clear potential fit for the Marlins in general, not just for Jazz or potentially Brian De La Cruz, but they need bullpen help. You have Tanner Scott. The Mariners are almost in win now mode, where they look behind them and the Astros are nipping at their heels, and their division lead has shrunk from 9 games, 10 games to now just about 3 games, and they lost again yesterday. I feel like the Mariners have to make a move and make a move now. And I think the Baltimore Orioles, are another team that I would like to see the Marlins in some capacity work with, because I look at their farm system and the Mariners have a couple guys in particular, Cole Young and Lazaro Montes. Lazaro Montes in particular is somebody I would love to see in the Marlins system. If you can work out a trade and get one or two of those guys. Montes reminds me a lot of Yordan Alvarez in terms of his stature and just his pure power at the plate. Something that the Marlins really don't have in their system is a big, strong guy like that who can hit consistent power. I mean, Griffin Conine, yes, but the strikeouts and the low contact rate is always going to plague him. And I think it's fair to say at this point that, yeah, Conine probably isn't going to develop into a perennial all-star. I mean, they haven't given him a shot. They haven't given Troy Johnson a shot. Probably see him at the end of the year, I would assume. But as for the Mariners, the two guys I'm looking at are Lazaro Montes and Cole Young. I know you've mentioned before Ty Pete, the shortstop prospect over in Seattle, and it's one of those guys that kind of fits Peter Bendix's philosophy. Get a young, very developmental prospect who can kind of grow in your system from day one. So Seattle is a team to look for, in my opinion, and also Baltimore. I don't know what the price tag would be, but you look at their catching prospect, 19 years old, Samuel Basallo in Double A, absolute stud at the plate. I mean, can hit for power, can hit for average, good contact rate, and defensively, he's limited to catcher and first base. Well, the Marlins don't have any catchers besides, you know, in the system they have Joe Mack, but the jury's still out on him. And at the major league level, Nick Fortes and Ollie Sanchez obviously aren't the future. Orioles have Adley Rutschman for the foreseeable future. Could the Marlins potentially get a deal done with them? So those are the two main teams I'm looking at.
Yeah, with the Mariners, And you did bring up Dela Cruz, who maybe I could have mentioned before, but he's another one where it's complicated. There's not that urgency to deal him when he
Mhm.
still has 3 more years of club control. He's playing all right this year, but I guess of lately he's gradually tailed off at this moment. DLC is he's just barely over a 700 OPS this year as a corner outfielder DH type. Like for the Mariners in particular, I agree that they make a lot of sense because it seems like I watch a lot of Mariners games and their offense is just, it is for a contending team. It is shocking just how stagnant they've been in that regard. What makes the Jazz fit a little complicated is because they do have that everyday franchise center fielder
Mhm.
in Julio Rodriguez. The complication is that he's a part of their offensive struggles where he's been so much worse than they could have thought. He's been a worse player this year than Jazz has been, but obviously they're going to give him the longest of leashes to continue playing every day in center. They do have kind of a void at second base, though, where maybe that does work, where Jazz goes into second base, where they've gotten terrible production this year, plays there every day down the stretch. I had thought of them when it came to DLC because they also are getting underperformance from their corner outfielders and their DH, where a DLC is a significant upgrade for them. And my aspiration was to have a Ty Pete centered deal. Maybe just even a 1-for-1 to get Ty Pete would probably be a really big win for the Marlins if they were to do that. He was a really highly regarded draft prospect just a year ago, and he's performed very well as a teenager in low A. Yeah, when I think about the Marlins right now, I think yeah, when you're just kind of stating the obvious right there, where they just have these long term questions at both catcher and at shortstop. And so any guy at any level of the minors that you could get that has above average starting caliber ceiling at those positions, that's the goal to add. But if you want to be like really specific, especially in the lower minors at the low A and the high A level, there is absolutely nothing resembling a shortstop prospect. That's why Ty Pete came to mind because the guys that they play at shortstop at those levels in Jupiter and Beloit this year, it's they're guys that either shouldn't be at those levels or ones that just don't profile as starting caliber big leaguers. Where any addition that they had, those are voids in their system that they could plug pretty easily in those deals. Yeah, the complication is that when you're getting younger players, they're riskier. There's a higher rate that they just don't amount to anything. Um, if you can get those guys without trading Jazz, if you can get them for these other pieces that you have on the market, then that's the hope right here. Yeah, in terms of Jazz's fit, aside from Seattle as a second baseman, I think it was both Kevin and Isaac on my staff. They've been thinking about him to Pittsburgh and how he fits as their center fielder because they've been getting very poor production from center field this year. Pittsburgh is not that same win now team as perhaps the Mariners or the Orioles are right now. It'd be quite a surprise if they made it to the postseason this year, and their focus is mainly next year is probably where realistically their window opens. So that is also what makes it a little complicated to, and that's why you haven't seen seismic deals. With all due respect to Aaron Savali, who was moved today, you haven't really seen any significant deals because there are still so many teams that are on the bubble and haven't decided for themselves whether they're buying or they're selling yet. I'd put Pittsburgh in that group. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we thought the Cubs would be a really logical trade partner for the Marlins, and they have underperformed. They've been like the third worst team in the National League this season, where they're trending towards being a seller. But nothing is written in stone until we get much closer to the deadline, and the math in terms of how realistic it is for them to get back into the race becomes more real. Yeah, that's ultimately why it's uh, a lot of these mock trade ideas are, you got to keep it focused on the ones that are leading their division right now, because the wild card races in both leagues and especially in the National League is still so blurry right now. But I'll mention the Yankees as well as a pretty obvious partner when it comes to relief pitching, especially Tanner Scott, but really any reliever for the Yankees, where they just have a beyond their closer and Clay Holmes. They have this big sea of question marks in their pen in terms of guys that you actually trust in high leverage situations. They're right there with the Orioles as a team that is almost a lock to make the postseason. They have a lot invested in this year, by their standards, a 15-year championship drought feels like an eternity. So they're one of those organizations that perpetually churns out new quality prospects throughout year over year over year. No matter how low they're drafting, they've become a really impressive machine for churning out those guys. So when it comes to seeking some sort of reliever at the deadline, they yeah, I think that might be where the Marlins get the most in return when it comes to shopping any of their bullpen arms.
And then really quick before we transition into a little bit of draft focus, the Phillies is another team. I know they're division rivals with the Marlins, but they are still seeking bullpen help. And Tanner Scott is obviously available at the deadline, a rental. So it kind of eases the stigma of trying to avoid trading a player who is going to hurt you for years to come, because Scott will be a free agent at the end of the year. I just wonder what the price tag kind of looks like for a guy like Tanner Scott, who might be the best reliever available at the deadline. Assuming the Athletics are going to hold on to Mason Miller, which they obviously should, it looks like Tanner Scott might be the biggest name available. And with the Dodgers, Yankees, Phillies, Orioles all rumored to be in the mix for him, pretty much any contender, really. The Phillies are a team where I'm looking through their farm system, and their 10th ranked prospect, Gabriel Racones Jr., big outfielder, um, big power hitter, can play the corner outfield at a decent level. He's in Double-A right now. But I wonder, is that a price that the Phillies would be willing to pay for a true rental? I mean, that the market is going to be set, I think, by Tanner Scott, because I don't see another reliever really making headlines the way he could. So if they could get the Phillies 10th ranked prospect or something in the lines of that, obviously they're not going for the Andrew Painter or the Mick Abel, like the White Sox guys who are talking about trading Garrett Crochet, who should get a huge return. But if you're trading a solid closer, a really good reliever from the left-handed side, like the Phillies' 10th ranked prospect, if you're listening to this, look him up. Gabriel Racones Jr. is somebody to keep an eye on. But again, it just depends how he's pitching at the time of the deal. There's so many factors involved. It's going to be interesting to see. We're still about a month away from this really coming to fruition. But I do think the Marlins should look to trade him as soon as possible. I really
Yeah.
do, because you're only one or two bad outings away from all his value going down.
Well, on that last point, I think because you have all of last season as somewhat of a track record for Tanner, I think at this point, there's not going to be any overreaction to what happens from here until the deadline. Yeah, for somebody that has not only performed that well, but done it in so many high leverage situations, I think by win probability added, he has been the best reliever in baseball over those last two seasons combined. There's not a whole lot he can do between now and the deadline to screw that up. So I feel pretty confident that, because, as you also alluded to, the lack of alternatives, that they're going to get something decent in return. Specifically on Racones, I know that Alex Carver, a fish on the farm, would be delighted with you, because that's one guy in particular. He was drafted out of FAU, Florida Atlantic University, and
Yeah.
Carver has been hyping him up ever since then, the last couple of years, and he has exceeded some people's expectations in order to be somebody that you actually covet as a centerpiece in this kind of deal. So that has the Carver seal of approval right there. I'm indifferent to it. I think that does sound overall like a more than fair compensation for him. It just goes back to the fact that he is a rental. I think the perfect, when it comes to a reliever, even though team control isn't that big a deal, the ones that really bring back a haul are the ones that have at least an additional year, a full season beyond this season, just because the rest of this regular season is such a small sample. And it was reported by The Athletic. It's kind of stating the obvious, but they said the teams that are considered virtual locks for the playoffs at this point, the Phillies, Yankees, Orioles, and the Dodgers, were the ones that had specifically expressed some level of interest in Tanner Scott so far. And that makes sense, because with them, if they're so sure they're going to be in October to some extent, that makes a reliever, a rental reliever, significantly more valuable to them than it does to some of these other teams that are just scrapping to get in the first place. If you have a high degree of confidence that you're going to be playing in some sort of postseason series where theoretically throw out Tanner Scott 3 days in a row in a wild card series, if it comes down to that and you need to advance, like that is a pretty significant piece of value that he has overall as a deadline chip. So that is my theory, is that the best offer for Tanner is going to come from one of those slam dunk postseason teams. That's why I mentioned the Yankees, and I think the Phillies are one that are kind of in that same boat in terms of ones that have a lot of incentive. That a rental reliever means more to them than it does to some of these other contenders.
Now we are only a couple weeks away from the draft, and something that has kind of flown under the radar for a lot of Marlins fans in terms of rebuilding this team and getting prospect capital, the draft is just as important. If you look at surrounding clubs who have rebuilt successfully, the Orioles, the Astros years ago, building through the draft is key. And really, with this new front office in place and this new philosophy, this draft is really important because you don't have a top 5 pick overall. You're going to have to work with, I believe, the 16th pick overall and then working down from there. So the top talent, you're not going to get like a Travis Bazana or Jack Caglione down in Florida. You're not going to get those guys. So how you make your decisions this draft, do you go with pitchers? You went with Noble Meyer, Thomas White last year. It worked out really well. I think the consensus is you're trying to build a core of position players and develop them through your system. And there's a couple names floating around that I really liked. The first name I mentioned last week on the podcast, I opened up the mailbag. He said, who's a guy you'd like to see the Marlins target in the draft? And my gut response, initial response, is Christian Moore from Tennessee. I think Christian Moore from Tennessee, if he falls all the way to 16 to Miami, I would be shocked. But if he does, the Marlins should draft him without hesitation. I think he's the best bat the Marlins could get in the position they're in. And then the second guy I kind of wanted to mention was Seaver King out of Wake Forest because of his defensive versatility. Somewhere where the Marlins missed a couple seasons ago with Jacob Berry, it was all about the bat. He had huge issues defensively, and then it turned out he couldn't hit either. So Seaver King out of Wake Forest, kind of interesting note on him is he started out in Division II ball, but had a really good hitting streak. I believe 47 games in Division II, transfers to Wake Forest, and he has a lot of raw power and the ability to play not only the hot corner but in the outfield. So that might be a very intriguing prospect for Miami if Seaver King lands in their laps there at 16. But I wanted to ask you, Eli, who's a couple names that stand out to you from this draft?
Yeah, well, and what I'll mention to preface this is there's significant pressure to get this first rounder right, because the
Yeah.
Marlins don't pick again until number 56. In alternating years, sometimes their competitive balance round pick is a lot higher up, but this year it falls after the second round, meaning that pretty significant portion of their draft bonus pool is intended for that first round pick. We've done a lot of prep for this particular draft because we'll actually have in-person coverage of it in Texas for the first time. Hector Rodriguez is going to be there in the building for it. And he's done, I think, 19 different draft profiles to this point of individual players that are going to be available that we think with a high likelihood are either going to be drafted somewhere between number 10 and number 50 or so. And out of those 19, I think 16 are college position players overall. It's the logical thing to do because the combination of the higher floor that you get for guys that have significant track records in college, but also this draft class, that's kind of how it is unfolding, where there is a lot of depth on the position player side in college and just very little pitching to choose from in that range and really defend the choice. The Marlins surprised everybody last year when they took Noble Meyer. The rumors leading up to that pick were very similar to this year, where it's going to be position players. And going a year later, Noble is doing well, but so are several of those other college hitters that they passed on that generally were perceived to be the slightly more seem the better value picks hadn't they fall that much. And this year, there is a significant difference between being number 10 and now this year being number 16. I do agree that Christian Moore is a really intriguing guy because of that ability that he has to hit for power to all fields, where the ceiling is relatively high for a guy that I think will likely be around a number 16 overall for them to look at. Cam Smith out of Florida State. He may have played his way out of the number 16 range with how he did late in the season and into the postseason. His offensive production just really took off from there. Compared to those other two guys, he's further down on the defensive spectrum, where it's almost certainly going to be third base going to professional baseball when he gets there, rather than having any chance of contributing up the middle right there. I think a lot of people are on the same page here, but even though we talked about those needs that they have organizationally up the middle, you don't really draft for need when it comes to your very first round pick. It's about it's especially for this organization. It's about the guy that you trust the most to be able to hit someday at the big league level, whatever adjustments are going to be needed between college and getting to the majors in order to make that happen. Yeah. Beyond that, Carson Beng out of Oklahoma State. He's pretty high up on my own preference list to this point. He's an outfielder and had the stats across the board for a lot of these guys are pretty comparable. With him, it was an OPS right a little bit above 1,000 this year. What makes it so difficult with all these college guys is because there has been a steady offensive explosion in college baseball. If you look at these major conferences, the league average is sometimes 300 with a 400 on base and a 500 slugging. That's like the league average. That makes it really difficult to convert these guys going into pro ball, just because especially in the power department, it is kind of hard to discern what's real and what's not, because of the difference between the metal bats that they're using right now and how different it is switching off to wood bats. So you got to put a premium on guys that have produced in summer ball using wood bats over there, where it's a little bit more comparable to what they're going to see coming up in when they actually play in at the next level. So with Carson Beng, when he played in Cape Cod last year, it was a small sample, but did pretty well, hit 345 with an 838 OPS. That's something that increasingly you need to put a lot of weight on, is how these guys do in wood bat leagues, just because all of the college stats are really inflated.
That's an excellent point, because just watching the College World Series and watching some of the swings these guys put on balls, you're like, that should be a routine flyout, and somehow it goes, he pulls an opposite pitch for a home run. Like, that's not going to translate necessarily into the next level. But no, it's going to be an intriguing draft. It's going to be an interesting draft, one that Marlins fans should be paying attention to as well. This first round pick, it's all about, in my opinion, getting a hitter. You got to get a hitter probably at the college level, a little more advanced, and trying to develop him. I mean, the key for this team to return to the playoffs is developing hitters, developing pitchers we know they can do. Can you develop a core of the next hitters? Looking back on a couple drafts, the Jacob Berry draft, for example, just the other day, Brooks Lee, I saw a highlight of him hitting a home run, beautiful swing, and you just sigh, because that was the guy I wanted in that
And
draft
he's getting
personally.
very close to the majors with the Twins, it
Yep.
looks like.
And you look at the state of where Jacob Berry is in his progression, you cannot afford that. You just cannot afford that at this point in the rebuild, especially when you look at the major league roster. And there are questions in terms of players you're going to keep and then players you're going to trade away. Every move matters for this point for Peter Bendix and company. Every single move will be scrutinized, and I'll be here to talk about it. I know you guys will. And Eli, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast today. It's always a pleasure talking Marlins with you.
Sure. And this is looking ahead a little bit, but one of the most popular streams that we do every single year is live during the MLB draft. It's going to be that first day of it. It's going to be 5 p.m. on the 14th, right heading into the All-Star break. So I'm looking forward to it. It's considering, I guess it's a blessing that they're that far down in the first round, which means that it's going to be a very long show leading up to that first pick that they make. As you said, that it's going to be a really important day for the organization. And yeah, I'm excited to follow along with that process of it and then speak with the people responsible afterwards. So yeah, this is why you go through this year. The dog days of the season came really early because of how far they fell during the race. These next few weeks are going to be relative to that. It's going to be a lot more entertaining. So thanks again for having me on.
All right. And with that, let's go fish.